Hello again, Professor Snyder.
Hey, ready to time travel to the past, which is the future, or which is the present? We're continuing this conversation.
To what should have been the past, what should have long ago been the starting point for organizing society, the Golden Square, food, shelter, healthcare, education, free for everybody on the planet. What will that mean? What kind of world would that be? And so we have thus far gone through 6 parts of this conversation. We have 2 more to go. So we've covered definitions in the first part, along with foundations, the ideas, ideologies, and so forth. In the last one, we discussed experiences and methods. So what it would be like to experience, consume, and do work around these 4 things. And now we're going to move on to structures and ecology. So this is where we're going to take up the notions of the role of the state, if there is such a role that will be.
It's a way
revealed.
of imagining the state, whatever level on the local or confederated global level, of thinking beyond feudalism, thinking beyond capitalism, really moving into the world of a dignified golden square.
Yes. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a section on ecologies, considering the climate and how we address climate catastrophe and then potential repair and restoration. So this has been a long conversation, a lot of work, a big discussion, but just the beginning. Again, this ought to be what we expect. This ought to be the common sense. This ought to be where we start.
It's the morning call. It's the bell we have to ring until we achieve it.
So we are ringing that bell once again. So let's dive in to the next section, structures. This means looking at the shape, character, and purpose of our institutions broadly. So firstly, how might the institutions and social structures of society be different in the world of the Golden Square in order to guarantee food for all, in terms of thinking about the state first?
Let's talk about the state. And we're
talking about the state.
And then we'll talk about the local and global aspects. But the state itself, once again, I do think that we can use the state for capital injections when we talk about the Green New Deal. But
in terms
the management, the management
moving towards this,
exactly. Especially when we talk about the potential for food crop collapse in 3 to 5 years. We're getting very close to some real breakdowns. The 1.2 degrees warming that we already have starts to act like 2%, where Greenland's raining, for God's sakes. And so we will need state injections of capital, but the actual management is best suited for kind of local arrangements. So I think mostly for food, we're going to be looking at the Green New Deal in terms of the maintenance of food, and we have to reconstruct mixed, medium-sized farms throughout the country because of the ecological havoc of crop disruptions. We're going to have these fail-proof options of being able to rely on different parts of the United States for food, or globally as well, by really the recreation of mixed medium-sized farms, which we used to have in the 1950s. I mean, there was a great moment in Iowa during Bernie's campaign with Naomi Klein giving a very key speech in Iowa. And they asked how many local farmers were left. And, when they asked how many of your grandparents owned farms, there was these arms up. And then when they asked how many of you currently own a farm, and there's no hands go up, right? So it's not only the creation of meaningful, well-paying jobs, but the recreation of medium-sized farms.
There's a good point you make that in the reality of addressing climate catastrophe, things are very different than they would be otherwise. That changes the playing field in drastic ways when we look at each of these different categories, because wisdom we otherwise would have carried forward from 19th century revolutionary thinking, for instance, about how to reorder the world become totally different, because the dynamics at play and the dangers if we don't make real transformative, deep structural change in a short period of time.
We're having parts of the world just wiped away. We're having parts of the world wiped away. And part of that is agricultural, right? Where 2 summers ago, Iowa, 50% of it was underwater. And, you just can't have those kinds of things.
This, I think, hints at a little bit of what we'll get into in coming episodes when we look at some science fiction texts and we talk about some works from Octavia Butler and Kim Stanley Robinson and so forth, grappling with the reality possibilities of a world ravaged by climate collapse, and that we're not going to prevent it altogether, but that we're going to be dealing with the world.
Yeah.
It's baked into our
And that's
future,
one of the
so we're gonna
interesting
be
things
dealing
about
with
science fiction is science fiction, because of climate change, any speculative works are increasingly becoming more narrow because they're all going to involve a future involving climate change. Otherwise, it's just alternative history.
Yeah. But I do think that in terms of the institutions and structures that would be needed to guarantee a world of food for all, it might likely mean the growth of confederated municipalities, communes of communes, if you will, neighborhoods.
That's something we'll look into, hopefully, is the democratic confederalism as a social structure, as a rooted democracy, where there'd be a constant feedback loop where we look at food amounts in different areas and be able to distribute properly based on agricultural seasons and weather patterns.
Right. And that we would create networks of information sharing that would facilitate a global cooperative enterprise of guaranteeing clean air, water, and food to everyone. In a way, it does make me think of this project from Buckminster Fuller in the early 60s. He envisioned this thing that he called the world game as a kind of competition. That's why he called it the game, but as a competition for teams or individuals to come to compete and or cooperate to, in his words, make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offense or the disadvantage of anyone. And basically thinking about, if we have enough data that we can see on a computer, and this is in 1961, he's thinking about, well, we could see all the relevant data on a computer, and then we can make...
But there's no doubt going forward that the crop disruptions from climate chaos will be so immense that we're going to need capital injections for doing large aeroponic growing centers. So like in Moreno Valley, we have all these warehouses that I could see easily becoming part of a future economy, but they'll require a lot of capital because we cannot really grow food like we used to. We're going to have to be subsidizing a lot of our crops through indoor facilities that are built and designed to withstand massive ecological crises, whether it's droughts, whether it's hurricanes. More and more of our food's going to have to be grown indoors. And that's something that's not being talked about. It's worthy of an article, is what happens when climate chaos is so disruptive that it's not just about injections of capital to do mixed-size farming, but even when mixed-size farming isn't good enough, where we will need to actually start using the dead malls, the dead manufacturing warehouses, and start building aeroponic centers for growing that use 5% water. They don't use any pesticides. But I do think that's going to be a big part of the Green New Deal, is taking food and putting it indoors.
Well, yeah, in one way you see all of the speculative imagining and technology research that one would imagine going towards the terraforming of Mars and surviving on planets other than Earth are actually going to need to be put to use here. Because
yes, exactly.
This is turning into...
This is turning into Mars. We're losing our atmosphere. We're losing biodiversity. So the Mars is happening here. We're turning into Mars. You're not going to get to Mars, but you're going to have to actually use the ideas of Mars here.
Yeah, exactly. In a realized world of the Golden Square, where we guarantee food, shelter, healthcare, and education to everyone, we would have no need of the state as such. It is a state abolition trajectory. It is an abolitionist trajectory where the state is no longer necessary once it's politically feasible and practical to do so. So building the Golden Square is an abolitionist project, but strategic statism, as we've often referred to it, may be a set of necessary political calculations within our existing order that we necessarily have to do to open up the cage of the state. But our building of dual power by creating institutions outside of the state and trying to transform the state itself should all be aimed towards the eventual abolition of the state.
I.e., e.g., communism.
Exactly.
The thing that Marxist-Leninists talk about but never have any history of implementing.
Anarchist communism. So I think all of the responses to this prompt across the four categories here in terms of the state have this in mind. An anarchist communist future is what we have in mind. And the Golden Square helps to open up. But I think as you illustrate, paradoxically, some forms of state socialism, like you're saying, is capital injection to fund projects in the here and now, and so forth and so on. And this is how we see climate change making this a potential reality, may in fact be the only politically feasible way that we ever gain sufficient leverage toward ultimately abolishing the state.
Yeah, and so the capturing of the state, the smashing of the state is really about capturing its capital. And that capital then gets put into local sovereignty, community action, local governance. And so the municipal forms of how that capital is used is really crucial. So really, when we talk about capturing the state, it's absolutely vital. There's a great section in Naomi Klein's This Changes Everything where she talks about a local farm in Vermont by Bill McKibben that's agricultural, that's horizontal, that's organic. It gets flooded by these historic floods and it's entirely destroyed. And a commune-only approach is not going to be the wise approach given climate chaos. There's going to be no gradual transition to communes when we have climate chaos. We actually have to seize the state. But in doing so, have an awareness of the tragic fault lines the state enacts on us.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to the management of capital and the implementation of action, especially for food and shelter, those need to be definitely horizontal and locally organized.
This again points to this crux of this Marxist-Leninist debate of the past century and a half, and why
false binary.
It's a false binary, but also why what might seem sort of contradictory to some who might hear this conversation is, how is this anarchist if you're taking a position that advocates for some kind of use of the state in any way, is black and white in that way?
Exactly.
That things are fucking fucked up and complicated.
And complex.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're reduced to lifestyleism.
Right.
Anarchism is a lifestyle because it requires nuance and complication and also moving beyond a kind of binary.
But what's not complex, what is not up for debate, is the fact that as human beings, we all need food, shelter, healthcare, and education. And those, therefore, all must be decommodified.
Yeah.
So that's why our focus is there.
Yeah.
Because if our focus is on this debate, this Marxist-Leninist...
It's an ideologue debate. It's a debate about abstraction.
Yeah.
It's a debate about abstraction. And anarchists are supposed to be interested in praxis.
Yeah.
And if anarchists are interested in praxis, that means that we have to create institutions. And one of the great critiques of Marxist-Leninism on anarchism is its inability to actually be interested in quote-unquote power or to create institutions, which I think is the more substantial critique of lifestyle anarchism, which so besets America and other countries, is this: we're going to form our own mutual aid clinics and have poor people feed poor people, but that's not actually creating a new institution on food and agriculture, right? And we need to create new institutional horizons that require, once again, a necessary awareness of the power structure that is currently there. And the state's going to state. The state is going to state. You can do what you want in your local autonomous zone, but the state's going to state. Yeah. And if you don't reimagine institutions, then you're not going to create anything permanent.
Reimagine them to provide for human need in an ecological way. And sorry, I didn't mean to get all
No, absolutely. I think
I
think it's a false binary. I think we're talking about that with an awareness that we're not going to have this massive transformation of intergalactic, communes all over the planet in the 10-year timeline that we're on. And we're on less than a 10-year timeline, honestly. If we're having things that happen at 2%, that's 1.2% degrees, we're having the kind of calamities already. We're already having crop disruptions and growing cycles disrupted. Season cycles for growth are changing. So we do need to seize the state, but seize the state in a way that we release the purse strings, the money, for the management of society along anarchist lines. And that's crucial. And this is where we can think in terms of outside the binary.
Moving on to the second part there, structures and food. How might institutions and social structures of society be different in order to guarantee food for all in terms of on the local level and the global level?
Well, definitely on the local level. We're still talking about food, right? So I think what's important to think about the local level is, once again, the state is where we get our capital, where we get our injections of cash, the Green New Deal, to do medium-sized farming and also increasingly density structures for aeroponic growing facilities. But the local management is very crucial. And this is where we come up to an understanding of the management of agriculture is something we do. So it's not just undocumented people managing food. It's all of us. Yeah. Their potentials get expanded as ours move into areas of life that we are disconnected from. And there's a real net benefit for us getting involved in agriculture on a mass level, which is really getting in touch with nature. We know from people with their hands in the soil, working and taking care of life and plants, are more likely to be able to take care of other people.
Yeah. This highlights the diversification of work and how work is distributed and how many more of us would have the opportunity to participate in the local food systems, in the cultivation and agriculture locally. And in terms of the institutions and social structures, I think this would mean that the food systems and institutions, structures of food systems become much more highly localized.
Exactly.
But also broadly diversified.
Exactly. So it's not just every neighborhood a university, it's every neighborhood a garden. Right?
Exactly.
We can
Every
imagine
neighborhood a farm.
different regions of your city where there are growing facilities, either outdoors or indoors, where it's walkable, bikeable to do the labor on that. So the balanced job complexes, we could create through the management of resources, much like hospitals or universities, we could decenter them so that you could actually have a walkable place to do that labor one day out of the week where you're maintaining or dealing with produce and the growing of crops. And you're not having to go to the echelon areas of the city. So we talk about the urbanization of the world, and right now 80% of Americans live in some type of city or suburb. But we can imagine where rural society starts to coalesce inside the city, where
there's a balance
agricultural and forests are balanced in there.
Yeah. Across all four parts of the Golden Square, all of these categories, we see that networking and communications technologies, free of the constraints of capital and the monopolies of industry, become actually able to realize their utopian potential that was so oft remarked upon early on in their development. That actually we would be able to utilize networks of information sharing and knowledge across the globe in a way that would benefit us all. We would imagine a global network of ecological sharing taking root, but no more of these vast networks of complicated arrangements of shipping for non-native foods and foodstuffs all across the globe just to satisfy bourgeois tastes. We would instead create ecologies of food production
chasing after
systems.
the wealthy, right? Where we're chasing after the means.
If you imagine every commune of communes, every neighborhood, university becoming self-sufficient to a high degree, but also deeply networked across the globe, we create a much more resilient ecology for all of these things. So that sharing is not a matter of producing in places with the lowest cost and then shipping where we can get the most return out of them. They're actually just networks of solidaristic mutual aid. And I think in thinking about this, it's not something that I envision as international, because that implies a nation state, something that is shared globally without nation states and without borders. Creating a broad network of global cooperation that would be a defining characteristic of the world. This network of global cooperation would be one of the things I think that would characterize a world of the Golden Square, distinct from our current order, and would be foundational in creating conditions of freedom across the globe. This isn't a techno-optimist kind of fantasy necessarily. It's just if we could use technology
for the common good.
For the common good. Just as it is now. We don't need new, we don't need some new fantastical sci-fi invention. Just technology as it currently exists. We have this capacity. So shall we move on then? So shelter, how might institutions and social structures of society be different in order to guarantee shelter for all in terms of the state?
Once again, as with food, when it comes to structures, we view the state as a really necessary element for mass housing. So infrastructure
in
projects. We're seeing this finally with the human infrastructure bill that's $3.5 trillion, which would have a definite beneficial effect on the 40% of U.S. bridges that are basically defunct and have D ratings. But also what's not in the human infrastructure bill is really visionary implementation of mass housing, creating 10 million new homes in the United States. Now, there's a bill by Ilhan Omar who would actually loosen the purse strings for social public housing and community land trust funding. And in California, we have about a $500 million budget for community land trusts. It's currently not being used because there's not enough people doing it right now. And of course, it's very hard to do it because you have to show that you've done it once to do it again. And so it catch 22. So definitely, like with food, I've envisioned the role of the state to open up the goddamn purse, pull out that wallet, get the money out. That's what we want the state to do.
Right.
And once again, the policies and legislation that occur should be rooted in local community concern and be deeply rooted to local community action. But once again, I view the role of shelter when it comes to transportation and when it comes to clothing, when it comes to the necessity of housing, that we want their money. We want the state's money.
Yeah. We want the money now so that within the current paradigms, we can make those changes that are necessary to move towards these guarantees of these essential human rights, to move towards a condition where we no longer need the state and the money of the state. So I think that's an important laneway to recognize and see clearly in the envisioning of transition from our current capitalist hellscape to a world of the Golden Square, to a socialist reality. But I think that in terms of the state structures that currently shape how shelter is managed and realized in our world, one big consideration is zoning, regional city zoning. What kind of structures go where and what kind of infrastructure goes where is a huge thing. We talked about how so much of the land of cities and municipalities is zoned for, in terms of residential zoning, zoned for single family housing, and how problematic that is, how much of an impediment that is. So altogether, zoning is a huge consideration, and it's a tool that is wielded by state capitalism to shape cities according to the pursuit of profit, which has all these exclusionary, discriminatory knock-on effects and shapes our lives.
And it shows you the downward effects of the family becoming a source of monopoly power in terms of design and also the way in which resources are used. It's not fair for so many people that don't have 2 children or 3 children to have to live in environments that aren't designed for them.
And it illustrates the incompetence and irrationality and illegitimacy of the state. Because our zoning measures, as they are, based on need at all. They're not. They're not based on need. And sure, all kinds of administrators will want to make all kinds of apologist excuses for rationalizing why zoning is a certain way, and they'll always invoke health and safety and other kinds of guardrails that are in bad faith argument. But we would see in the building of the world of the Golden Square that directly democratic municipalities would be far more capable at the science of the study of human needs and of the science of the means to satisfy them than the state currently is. So what we now call neighborhood, city, or regional planning would become a wholly meaningful and truly participatory activity that we would all have opportunity to engage in directly democratic ways, and not just theoretically open to public input. The shape of our cities through planning is often called public, but it's not really. So importantly, this gets to the role and influence and domination of the public in public land by developers. The role of developers, especially in local politics.
We get this almost like nearsightedness with how things operate, because really when it comes to the way that private interests function, it's very much nearsighted versus farsighted. What you see up close and what you see far away. And our attachment to money in politics and corruption is often about the federal level, fossil fuel industry, big pharma, big ag, but we ignore the very close things, close to our vision of the massive level of corruption within the cities, right out of our door, right in our neighborhood. The city councils and mayor races and even our state, nobody pays attention to state politics, but there's a massive level of corruption in that. And we're seeing really the destruction of habitats, ecologies, and solidarities because everything's about the police unions and about private land developers. They own the cities. And you can see the way cities are designed based on who controls them. For instance, the city next to Riverside where I live and work is Corona. And Corona is a horrible city to drive through, both on the highway and also in the city itself. It's massively congested because everything was about cramming as many homes as possible. And so it's basically a bed town for people that can't afford Orange County. And it's a miserable place to drive and move through. Now, it has money, but it's a miserable city because it has no universities. It doesn't have anything else other than homes. And on the poor scale of that, you have Moreno Valley, where it's these giant empty lots of miles and miles of empty acreage and substandard housing, but there's no libraries. There's no important downtown or cultural center in Moreno Valley. I once asked my students when I teach at Moreno Valley College, do you have a place in the city that you love and admire? And they can't name a single place in Moreno Valley, their city of 200,000 people, where they admire or worship or celebrate something about their city. There's no accomplishments. because it's been designed for private land developers.
Just to get rent out of people.
Just to get rent out of people.
Just to get rent out of people.
And people who are investing, buying homes in those areas are often sometimes people from Orange County that are just using rent extraction. And so they don't care about what actually happens in the city. They just want
to be a landlord.
Make a buck. They want to be the boss. Exactly.
Yeah.
They want to be the land baron. And so we see the tragedy of both the downward vision, down strata, middle class life in Moreno Valley versus the more upwardly striver components of Corona. And then you have the University of California and Loma Linda and RCC in Riverside, which has a more diverse level of interest because the land developers don't control to the degree that they do in those other cities.
Yeah. All of these companies vying for influence of the state, companies, corporations that are lobbying the state, that are trying to shape the politics of the state at local and federal levels. We will see that in the world of the Golden Square, all of these need to go away and would necessarily have to go away. So no more property development companies. Those are gone. Properties need to be developed, aka we need to
through community action and civic deliberation, through a process of democratic deliberation, right?
Exactly. So
rather than private plunder and what I can squeeze out of motherfuckers.
Yeah. So we would likely see democratic guilds and clubs and co-ops of designers and architects and engineers and folks actually doing the work and involved in the expertise of creating and caring for and maintaining shelter. And those would flourish. We would see lots of every neighborhood would have lots of those, and everybody would be welcome to be involved.
And there would be less mental abduction of the two-party system in that deliberation because we all would like the same kind of neighborhoods, many of us, in terms of walkability, in terms of having clean air, good water systems. There is a real area of agreement and accord about what would be good communities. And by allowing for municipal deliberation and town hall summits and participatory budget planning, we would see that much better than the private backdoor deals with city council members and the land developers who fund their campaigns.
Yes. There would be no more evictions. There would be no more cops. Because when we start from human need, as the Golden Square is.
And demands.
As it demands, instead of power and profit, we create much more innovative, effective, and efficient solutions. And we do so without policing or prisons. This is important. Which means that we can finally do away with the carceral state and with bureaucracy altogether. So these are really important realizations that follow from the foundation of the Golden Square. So moving on to the second part of this prompt, how might institutions and social structures of society be different in order to guarantee shelter in terms of the local and the global, at the local level and in a global sense?
Well, I think the best through line right now, given the lack of democracy in our lives, is the community land trust formation. Social public housing is very good. It's one of the ways to decommodify housing, but I don't think it necessarily means a lot of democracy and deliberation. And when we think about community horizons, I think there's more democratic potential in local action through community land trust because social public housing as it's done currently is often through government intervention.
Unless it is, as we've mentioned in our conversations about it, unless it is facilitated by community land trusts, which is a potential, right? Is a way that those two things can intermingle and actually fuse together in sort of one kind of solution.
But I kind of see it as, once again, social housing from capital, in that the community land trust is probably the best arrangement because of the distrust, decades of distrust about the government and housing, that by organizing and deliberating over what makes a good community, by moving back to indigenous notions of property, communalizing things, where essentially the community land trust isn't a warring competition between different community land trusts, but becomes citywide decommodification process. So we can see that we start with these tertiary prefigurative movements of building supplemental housing, and then once it gains mighty power, it starts to buy and decommodify formerly privatized homes through both that solidarity housing, which we'll give a link to, but also through reverse mortgages, where people that are elderly and older that need income, the community land trust can buy their house and give them monthly payments for that house. And then when they die, the land moves back under decommodified ownership.
I think our institutions set up to guarantee shelter for all would exist primarily at the local level, primarily in terms of popular assemblies and community land trusts, and any democratic formation are prefigurative activities of what a real direct democracy would be. And so it'd be popular assemblies at the communal level and that
Open budgeting.
right, all of those things, but then networked globally. So I think there is a way to rationally and clearly see how a decentralized and hyper-localized democratic arrangements of looking out for these things create individual nodes on a global mesh of communication to balance the needs of everybody.
And it could
across the
have
globe.
global implications. When we talk about refugees and climate chaos, we could talk about the construction of emergency housing. Also, when we talk about domestic abuse and the patriarchy, we could talk about safe houses for people, that we wouldn't have to worry about places for people to decommission. So we could look at housing on the local level for interfamily disputes, basically cooling off zones, right? So
and the cooling off of high concentrations of populations in mega cities. That the balance of population density across the globe will be much more rational when we're all chasing for the means to make ends meet through the vicious cycles of capital. Then that's what's driving migration and concentration into urban
many
areas.
people chase the big cities not because it's their favorite design of a city.
No.
It's because they monopolize work and labor.
And pleasure.
And you have this unequal distribution of capital. And that's what's inherent in Trotsky's writing, but also in Rosa Luxemburg's writing, is that there's this unequal distribution of capital in geographies and areas that were hyper undeveloped and areas that are hyper developed, where you have Los Angeles versus something like Hemet or Moreno Valley, which have a lack of development in proper ways. And so if we look at the way that housing is currently constructed, there's lots of areas right now where you could get a job, but you can't afford the housing in that area where you work.
Get a job in the food service
Very quick
industry.
for $12 an hour, $11 an hour.
There you go. So anyways, I think that is one of the implications that I think is really exciting to think about, is how some places that are actually beautiful, wonderful places geographically to live, they'd be great places to live, but there's just like, there's no industry there. Or maybe they were places that were developed because of certain industries that are now defunct. And so they are like ghost towns. So all of these ghost towns that may actually otherwise be great places ecologically, in terms of meeting human needs and desires, people can actually start to settle there. And so that we can have actually everywhere becomes awesome.
Yeah, there's areas of hyper fecundity and growth for food, but there's no jobs for the area to do that food. So if you want a city that could have the Golden Square, it can't because of this manufacturing plant has closed down.
Yeah. Okay, moving on to healthcare. How might institutions and social structures be different in order to guarantee healthcare when we think of the state?
This is where the state's really going to need to be involved, because we have a massive amount of decommodification. 19% of the U.S. economy is in the healthcare sector. Both big pharma, pharmaceutical, preventative, Medicare, all of these things. We're going to need massive uses of capital for the Green New Deal.
This is also where it highlights a real contradiction and a real paradox at play, because, as you say, within the current order, how are we going to alter healthcare system in order to start to meet these needs without the use of state funds, right?
Exactly.
Federal funds to make that kind of transition on the one hand, but on the other hand, we have things like with the state doing what the state does, state's going to be Staten.
State's going to be Satan.
The state's going to be Satan, with the Supreme Court making way to illegalize abortions with that ruling on the Texas abortion law.
Yeah, well, after 6 weeks, you can't get an abortion at all, basically. And so we have that thing where it's the paradox where the state is removing access to health care for people that are pregnant, at the same time that we want the state to meaningfully create positive freedom. So there's Isaiah Berlin's notion of positive and negative liberty, which speaks to that paradox, because we know if you're not being an ideologue, that governments come in different sized cages. And governments can create freedom at the same time that can also restrict freedom.
Yeah, they can get out of the way. They can create freedom by getting out of the way.
Yes. And giving us our goddamn money. Giving us our goddamn money and getting out of the way. And so that's the paradox. We want the state for its money, but we don't necessarily want it to be making all the decisions.
It's a paradox, too, because, we're told that liberalism and republicanism are supposed to be the best and only practical approaches, and that they're their only rational systems, because they include things like separation of church and state, quote unquote, and so-called systems of checks and balances and so forth.
Separation of different types of tyrannies.
Yeah, but that's just wholly ironic when we see that it's actually the opposite that they do, right? They ensure that the church and the state are indistinguishable. They ensure that there's no effective balance or check against power. It's quite ironic, because the liberal state is inherently undemocratic. And this is sometimes I confuse the notions because when I think of democracy, I'm always thinking of direct democracy. So if we did actually live in a democracy, the state would actually be us. The state would actually be you and me. We probably wouldn't call it the state as such, but that's what it would mean if there was such thing as actual
It'd be called
democracy.
the aura.
It would be called our collective aura.
Or our aura, our crystal chambers.
The other thing that moving towards healthcare for all means is abolition of the state insofar as it creates exclusionary boundaries toward the provision of healthcare based on race, class, gender, and fame, the other big social structure of exclusion and domination. Okay, so the second part, how might institutions and social structures be different in order to guarantee healthcare in terms of the local scale and the global scale?
Well, I think one of the necessary things that we're seeing with COVID as well is we need to make medicine as low cost as possible globally. So when it talks about the expense of healthcare medicine, we're seeing huge surcharges on medicine. Now, what we did for AIDS and HIV for medicines, we basically kind of removed the IP for AIDS and HIV, but the greed is so pronounced right now with COVID, for instance, that there is no IP waivers for COVID vaccines, but we did do them for Africa with HIV medicine, but somehow now we can't do it. So one of the really important things is to think about local costs and global costs as a combined ethical dilemma. Right? That we actually need to make free, low-cost medicine that's available at point of entry. And once again, decommodified big pharma means that we spend the money for pharma and pharmaceutical research and the production of pharmaceutical research as a net positive that is not organized around private plunder.
Yeah. Additionally, in thinking about the scale of the local and the scale of the global, we often hear stories about, especially in rural areas, where people don't have access to adequate healthcare. And the distances people have to go, just ridiculous. Part of meeting the demands of these human rights to healthcare means that it is reasonable to get to the care, right? So every neighborhood, a university, everywhere that people...
Every neighborhood, a hospital. Right?
Every neighborhood hospital.
One of the complexities of healthcare right now is that it's often relying on urban populations to provide healthcare in smaller rural communities. It's a huge mistake. So you have countries like Peru where most of the doctors are coming from Lima, but they're not actually rooted in the local communities. Well, it'd be much better to have someone who has intergenerational connection to their community becoming the doctor for their community. And so that's the problem of centralizing hospitals and the medical field to urban spaces is we have a lack of general practitioners in very small towns because there are people that aren't rooted in the town, so they have no interest in living there. They have no network, friendships, connections.
When we free up the movement of people and the movement of knowledge, then people can actually take root in communities. So that communities can actually become whole and have everything that we need to meet the demands of the Golden Square, to meet our demands as human beings, our necessities for dignified life. It is the impediment of systems of domination and hierarchy and capital that keep us from making whole communities. So this is part of what would allow us to make whole communities and make healthcare available to everyone where they live. Okay, want to move on to education now?
Yeah.
So how might the institutions and social structures of society be different in order to guarantee education to all when we think of the state?
Well, we could think of the absence of the state in education because the federal government doesn't pay for anything. In Japan, it's a responsibility and obligation of the Japanese government to pay for university education. And right now, everybody has a secret tax they don't want to talk about, which is that the states are responsible for providing most of the budget of education.
This is at the crux of what you keep referring to in each of these and the need for state infusion of funds.
Capital.
Of capital in order to make way for the just transitions towards the Golden Square is that it's all bound up on the notion of money and the exclusive sovereign domain of the state in issuing currency.
We want our goddamn money because the government exists through taxation policies. That's how you control inflation and all these things is through taxation policies. And we're being taxed, and we're being taxed at relentless levels. If you consider copays and deductibles, that's an example of that. So right now for education, we're being taxed through income tax and sales tax to pay for something the government doesn't pay for because the government's too busy spending $1.3 trillion a year on military. And so we want our money back because it's already been captured by other interests.
Right. just as we would say about any position of power, same would go here in terms of money. One would only desire that thing in order to abolish that thing. So we desire the money of the state in order to abolish money and the state. Kind of a paradox.
And we live in a world of paradoxes. That's actually how the world is. That's what dialectical, materialism and all this kind of conversation is. We live in a world of paradoxes.
Yes.
And that's what the real world is. And by masturbating to lifestyle anarchy, you're not going to get anywhere. By masturbating to Marxist-Leninism, you're not going to get anywhere. The dual power is really the dual power of ideologies, of taking strategic statism of a Marxist social state structure and also melding it with anarchist praxis. And so when I think of dual power, I think of, well, number one, education. We need to get the purse strings open. Now, certainly healthcare and education are expensive, but we need to open up the purse strings.
Yeah. It's also why we often will pull up examples to illustrate how feasible a change to or a transition to decommodification would be if the state chose to do it, because the state has all the funds and they could pay for everything. That's just a matter of political will. How do we pay for it? Well, we just have to have the political will to do it. It's not a matter of the available funds. The state makes the funds.
And education's fascinating because it might be the most low carbon of these golden square nodes. And so when we think about...
In terms of the work that currently
exactly,
is into
it's literally people-to-people labor. And so the reciprocity that's needed, it means that we can create a lot of good-paying jobs, meaningful jobs, enriching jobs with small class sizes. And once again, if we open up the state, then we can actually think of local and global horizons.
But in a world where we met the golden square, where education was guaranteed to all, it would be a world where there were no longer neoliberal universities. And no longer run by politicians, as so many of the universities and university systems are. Chancellors, presidents, and so forth, the heads of these institutions.
Standardized testing in the carceral state, right? That
all of that.
Surveillance systems.
Well, right. I mean, the university and education altogether is no longer a tool of the state and of state social control to create pliable subjects for capital.
And as it currently exists, is a way to justify winner and loser society.
Yes.
So the cult of the smarts, which is that there are certain benighted people that get healthcare access and housing access and all these things, and other people, because they didn't do the right things academically, are therefore denied those rights.
And only those certain people who get to participate in public discourse, those certain people who play that game of competition, of the pursuit of accolades and renown and of fame, who then get to participate and therefore shape public discourse, including everyone in the so-called media, everyone in journalism. I think this is exciting to think about how, in a world where education is guaranteed to all, how media and journalism would undergo radical transformational change, or we would be talking about conditions of the world where media and journalism are radically transformed, so much so that it would be hard to conceive of whether or not there would be such a thing as mass media anymore. If the world is a world composed of every neighborhood a university, there's wholeness in our lives and meaningful engagement and community and work in our lives. Do we have mass entertainment? Do we have a Hollywood that's making the same myth story a million times over every year?
Absolutely.
And if there's no mass media, then are there celebrities at all? Is celebrity even a thing in this world? And this is where we get to that thin line. This is where we talk about that threshold. That is the threshold that is virtually indistinguishable between the world of the golden square and that of the utopian sphere. Because as we say, the moment we realize the world of the golden square, it will likely seem indistinguishable from utopia. It is not itself utopia, it is the bare minimum. But once we reach the bare minimum, it's going to seem like everything from there on is full of utopian possibility.
Yeah, so it's the social singularity.
Yes.
So the technological singularity, and this is the social singularity.
Yes.
The golden square is a social singularity where it's so hard to imagine. Even when I talk to Jesse, we're not recording, it's like, what would the world look like when we're living already in the world of the golden square? We would have a hyper singularity of explosive possibilities in people's lives.
Yeah.
We're maybe 10%, 15% of what we actually are in this current horizon. Imagine it in a world of the golden square.
if we wanted to spend our time in the historical record, probably see glimpses of it here and there, where the legacy of freedom opened up more possibility, where there were revolutionary ruptures. For instance, thinking of 1848 revolutions, the February revolutions, and how in Paris, hundreds of socialist clubs and newspapers
cultures
popped up. Culture started to really bubble up, once there's
creating that new common sense.
Yeah, once there's that little bit of space of opening up the cage of the state. And I think we see that again and again. When the cage of the state opens up, we fill it with all kinds of creativity. Okay, finally, in this category then, how might institutions and social structures be different in order to guarantee education when we think of the local and when we think of the global scale?
Well, I mean, I think this is where we talk about in our episode, the Every Neighborhood a University, is that the university is so preeminent in our lives that education's happening in all kinds of local spaces. So you're not driving to get an education.
Right. Thinking of education in the expansive way, and as we're just alluding to, as also including notions of media and journalism,
entertainment,
and our entertainment and our public knowledge sharing altogether and public discourse altogether, that a world of the Golden Square in this regard would necessarily mean the end of social media companies as advertising companies, as advertising monopolies. But I really wish there was clearer language in use in our vernacular to make clear that social media companies are just advertising companies. They are just advertising companies.
Because their profits are primarily organized around advertising. If something like 99% of Facebook's revenue is advertising, Google's 90%. So they are essentially advertising companies because that's where the profits come from. And so the types of social media it's created is around advertising.
It may just get lost in the noise of contemporary life, but the feed that we're all scrolling through all day long, all the time, is every 2, 3, 4 things are always advertisements. Just look, as you're now scrolling through Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, just count how many things are posts. And then also, I mean, the algorithm is also geared towards attention, right?
Abductions,
abducting,
intellectual abductions,
You're not seeing things because they're things that
might benefit you.
People shared or might benefit you. You're seeing things because they are attracting attention. They got a lot of likes. Somebody else liked them. They're getting a lot of retweets or reposts or whatever. So they're all just trying to funnel attention so that more eyeballs see advertising. So that goes away. So that's exciting. And what would be able to take root and blossom up in its place in terms of social connections over networks is going to be exciting to see. So in that way, again, we think about the early promise of the internet, the unrealized promise of the internet, once again, having an opportunity to blossom. But moreover, I'd be excited about the notion of apprenticeship. You talked about how often architecture of a campus is part of what draws people to certain universities and factors and choices of which universities to seek attendance in. But also, why do universities, these prestigious universities, try to get celebrity faculty, celebrity academics? Because those things attract people to those
economy.
Yeah. It's an attention funnel. So people are seeking out potential opportunity to study with certain people, right?
But these professors are never from the community that they're working at. So you can imagine a system where you apprentice with scholars and thinkers based on the hyper-regionalism and specificity of their innovation as a result of the local principalities they work in. That their innovation comes from the local areas they work in.
Yes, exactly. And therefore, in a world of the Golden Square, you can imagine there being regions of the world, cities, municipalities that take on a concentration of certain type of study and or practice or certain arts or...
Its hyper-regionalism is part of its innovation.
Right.
It's no longer a cartel where you're trading marketable goods of professors that move around like baseball cards in saran wrap. And so, they're not wrapped up in plastic and put in photo albums. It's actually the particular regionalism and localism of the educational systems create profound forms of innovation.
Yeah, and people would be able to move freely amongst them. So you could apprentice and study at any point in your life, wherever you would like. And that's really exciting to think about, that it wouldn't be just to be near someone who was a star.
You're using them as a career launching pad. Yeah, because typically it's a transactional thing. Relationships between students and professors are very transactional. They will lift my career by doing free research for me, and I will get them a job. It's super transactional. It's a very commodified relationship.
Right. So the other more meaningful incentives to study somewhere else or immerse yourself in some other district could actually be at play. So you might actually go somewhere for the local sort of ecology or the local practice of a certain discipline so that you could learn from that locality. And it would no longer be driven by all of those schemes of cultural capital, both economic and social, that drive people to certain locations. Okay, so final category. You ready?
Yes.
Get to
the
it?
most humbling and terrifying of them all.
Exactly. Our final category of consideration here is ecology. So thinking about the nature and quality of our relationships to the earth in terms of these 4 parts of the Golden Square. So firstly, how might a world of food for all affect the planet, the biosphere, and ecosystems? Thinking first in terms of climate change. So in terms of climate change and our effect on the planet and its ecosystems, how does food for all factor in?
Petrol state economies. We have to end the manufacturing production of food by using dead dinosaur blood to produce our food. So we have to start eliminating petrol components of food agriculture and the pesticides that kill biodiversity in plant and soil. And when we're doing traditional farming, organic or otherwise, using soil, we don't necessarily have to use soil for farming. We talked about aeroponics earlier, but we have to actually remove petrol from the agricultural. All elements of it need to be eliminated. We cannot use death for life.
And I mean, that's a big blinking red light. That's an obvious one. And unfortunately,
siren from the mountain.
Oh, yeah. And there's mountains and mountains of evidence about it, right? And there's all kinds of documentaries and so forth and so on to just familiarize ourselves with the terrain of food systems and food production in petrol, right? In the petrol state, both in terms of their impact on human health, but then also planetary, ecological, biosphere health, that it is clear and obvious that there is a way out. And there is a way to turn away from our practices that are one of the biggest contributors to climate collapse right now, and that is to transition to plant-based diets, which biggest thing of all is the lessening of dependence on petrol, the lessening of dependence on fossil fuels.
High energy.
Yeah, high energy, because as the current systems to produce feed for cattle, deforestation for space for cattle, and so forth and so on is one side of it. But there's also then all the water that goes into animal agriculture and the transportation of it, when plant-based agriculture can be much more local. So it's one thing to say that agricultural and the food system should be more localized, but if we're thinking of the food systems including all of the acreages for production of animal food, that's different.
The statistic I'll have to think about is like a single steak on your plate is 1,000 showers, right? The water consumption.
Yeah, we'll throw in the notes of the relevant things.
Oh, yeah, and it's energy intensive. And original agricultural hunter-gatherer societies knew that the slaughter and eating of animals was massively energy intensive. It was only for special occasions. Well, right now, the meat consumption is a special occasion every day. It's creating water scarcity. Clean water aspects are being affected by this. And of course, it's just not a very efficient way of organizing society when we have so many people to feed and we have soil depletion.
There's nothing but benefit to switching to more highly plant-based diet overall. Not only for our own health, but for the health of the planet, for the health of ecosystems. And part of it is when we can end the deforestation that is part of the agricultural industry, we make way for rewilding, for planting more trees. Let's put the trees back. That means we can breathe. The trees and the plants that produce the oxygen that we need to breathe, we can't just get rid of them all and have the cows won't even be able to live.
And the danger for ocean acidification, right? Which is really about the balance chemical levels of fish to water, and the proportion of fish to water life is, yes, indeed, there are places in the world that really require fish intake because they don't have agriculture. But what's happened like in places like Nigeria, and Mike Davis has written about this, which is Ebola came out of the hunt for bushmeat when large fishing companies took over Nigerian water flows. When the search for fish in Nigeria pushed the people that relied on fish into searching for bushmeat, further aggregating and making things more difficult. So we have to get rid of, once again, big food, because big food is a threat. You know, when you talk about big ag, this is a threat to everything. We have to actually create zones of sustainability.
Well, we already were sort of transitioning a little bit to the next part, and you mentioned rewilding. So the next part of the prompt is in terms of restoration and repair. So how would food for all affect the planet and ecosystems in terms of restoration and repair? We already mentioned that the land acreage that we can rescue from animal agriculture can be rewilded, thus helping to repair the clean air that we need and to restore healthy habitats for all kinds of species that are in danger of extinction. And it's not a small matter because the food systems are responsible for just blanketing the planet. One of the things that is the most notable anytime you are on an airline flight and looking out across the landscape is just the checkerboard of the entire landscape with
I can't remember the
agricultural.
statistic of how much of the Earth's surface is used for food. It's immense.
It is, well, I have it right here. It is 26% of the planet's ice-free land is used for livestock grazing, and 33% of croplands are used for livestock feed production. That's just massive amounts of land just for us to get hamburgers and stuff.
Yeah, and when we're talking about restoration and repair, we're talking about rewilding the ocean too, right? Where we actually, yes, nobody's going to be vegan overnight. That's not going to happen. Well, we should be making a very strong case for reductionarianism so that we start putting hard limits on how much we fish in the ocean. Much more draconian efforts are needed. We can't just push all of our pleasure buttons all the time. We have to really, really care about the biodiversity of the ocean. So not just in terms of livestock, but also the ocean. We have to repair the ocean quickly and rapidly by really acknowledging that the biosphere is not a 100% sacrifice zone.
No.
It's not this giant externalization machine we can continue to plunder without any kind of limits.
Can't just pile unlimited mountains of paper and plastic and trash everywhere and float them out in the sea. Or
I mean, there's so much plastic in the ocean, it's almost another land territory.
Yeah. And to the point about veganism, I think too much of the public noise around veganism and the disdain for the self-righteousness of vegans is part of the focus on wrongly individualizing problems and focusing just on symptoms of things. Yes, certainly, folks who have committed themselves and part of their life activity to animal rights. Right now I'm thinking of Moby. I don't know if you've seen Moby's tattoos that he's gotten in recent years about his animal rights and vegan for life tattoos and stuff. Have you seen those?
I know, but he's made it very insufferable, hasn't he? So the whole project.
Yeah.
It's once again, it is part of the neoliberal project to focus on individuals.
Right.
That's not to say we shouldn't take individual action or individual responsibility.
Right.
But 70% of all the pollution is coming from a series of companies, and we have to look at the Pentagon, which is the biggest carbon producer.
We falsely assign cause to the consumption side of the system when it's rightly needs to be in the ideology side, in the structure side of the system, not
the state side,
in
exactly.
The state side of the system.
It's not us to changing the market. It's actually maybe asking the state to regulate the market, to actually create hard caps for decisions and actually acknowledge the cost for things.
Yeah.
The actual cost for a hamburger is not accurate right now because it doesn't include our externalities.
And me eating plant-based is in no way changing the operations of the animal agriculture
Arc of human history,
industry.
because social change is collective change. The real transformation is collective change.
Yeah.
There's never been a point in history where someone did opt-outology and changed the arc of history.
Yeah. I'm not choosing to eat a plant-based diet because I think
That's the solution.
that's the solution. It
Those
is-
individual decisions are easier to make when they're formed around
Yes.
collective action.
Yes.
When you're making a case for veganism or reductionarianism or moving to plant-based diets, you're making the claim vis-a-vis collective action that's connected to it.
Yeah.
You might be able to actually advance individual action.
Yeah, because all of our individual actions and choices and circumstances happen within the context of larger communal and state and systemic structures. Okay, so moving on to shelter. How might having a world of free shelter for all affect the planet, the biosphere, and its ecosystems in terms of, first, climate change?
I'll put up the link where David Graeber talks about batshit construction and climate change and how much pollution is created, a massive amount of pollution from batshit construction.
Yeah.
And so it's hurting the environment as we develop things that we don't need, that shouldn't be being made. And they're being made in very terrible terribly unsound ways in terms of ecological practices. So the world of batshit construction. And so we have to imagine that the things we build might actually advance ecological harmony and actually increase ecological diversity. So think of that home as an extension of a biological diversity. It's not just the construction of the home, it's the things that are built around it that it could actually help enliven and diversify the horticulture in the area. And so that's the houses as something added to the environment.
And beyond just the house, the whole notion, the expansive notion of shelter, also think of infrastructure and transportation. And
the way we make clothing.
The way we make clothing.
The massive amounts of water used to make cotton, very soft cotton. We talk about soft toilet paper for our ass. You know, that's an element of the shelter, is sheltering us from poop, is the amount of water we're using and how we're using water. Are we using water for a bidet, or are we using water for toilet paper? Are we making clothing that's reusable and that lasts much longer, or are we creating a lot of fast fashion?
Yeah. This gets us thinking about, as we talked about in every neighborhood or university, walkable cities and getting rid of the need for automobiles, getting rid of the automobile as the thing that determines the shape of our whole built environment. It would necessarily mean the end of the fossil fuel powered automobiles.
And we think of the lives of animals and the lives of plants and the disruption that comes from all these freeways and highways and the pollution that absorbs into them, as well as the kind of environmental damage of the manufacturing of cars, which protect us and provide us transportation, and also connected to transport lanes and highways, to think about how's this going to work with ecology.
In no way are we, or am I thinking that a transition to a world of the Golden Square is about a transition from all the fossil fuel powered automobiles to electric. We're not just replacing every fossil fuel burning.
Keeping the same shit with just an electric battery inside of it,
There's also devastating harm involved in the production of batteries for automobiles.
Lithium-based, lithium-based.
All parts of the construction of automobiles. So altogether, whether they're fossil fuel powered or not, the construction and production of automobiles needs to decrease. So therefore, we need to have places to live. We need to have communities that aren't dependent on automobiles. We need to have a culture that isn't focused around the automobile. If we're going to create utopia for humans, that means we have to abolish the utopia for cars that we've created.
Yeah, and it's not the abolishment of cars. It's the abolishment of its center in our life. It's no longer a civilization of cars, a civilization of bioforms, right? It's larger ecology. So we should center our idea on ecosystems rather than civilization of cars.
Yeah. And, we talk about the free movement and freedom of movement, as we referenced previously, being part of the conception of a world of the Golden Square. So that means thinking seriously about transportation systems and infrastructures, but there are lower impact technologies already in wide use, but we're still, nonetheless, because of fossil fuel industries and automobile industries, still living lives based on the automobile and in houses with garages for multiple automobiles and so forth and so on in suburbs that are in no way walkable. But we think of the world of the Golden Square being a world where there's high-speed, solar-powered mass transit systems of rail, where there will likely be less air travel and different forms of air travel.
That's based on the current way in which the engines are made, right? So I'm of the opinion that we talk about Green New Deal as innovation for all-electric, fusion-based thrusters for planes. That might be easier to deal with than building a bunch of bullet trains throughout the United States, or at least on the West and East Coast. So if we are going to have fossil-based planes, we're going to have to reduce them mightily. But also we could imagine the Green New Deal creating innovations to reduce dramatically the amount of petroleum used for air flight.
So altogether, there's all kinds of transformations that need to happen. And I observe often that much of the public conversation when discussing notions of a Green New Deal or the need to adapt to climate change always focuses on this, the sort of sacrifices or changes that society and individuals will need to make in terms of transportation and automobiles and the like. So this is where there's the challenge. This is where I think there's a big challenge to meet technologically and in terms of our organization for production, because we do live on a planet that has this vast, virtually unlimited power
perpetual energy beam.
Perpetual energy source of the sun, the virtually unlimited power of the sun that's creating almost all of the power that is used on the planet.
And we've been disregarding it for 50 years. We've been disregarding it for 50 years, never actually saying or organizing our investment and research in solar power and renewables.
And it's not that we've been ignoring it. We've just been burning the ancient forms of it. The fossil fuels that we power most of everything with are just ancient solar energy stored in
Dead sunlight. It's dead sunlight.
Dead sunlight, dead plants and trees and animals, biomass buried in the ground. But when you think about it, in a single hour, there's as much power from the sun strikes the earth as the world currently uses in a whole year.
I think it's 10% of the land mass on the earth would be able to provide enough energy for the earth, just for 1 hour.
So figuring out how to harness a sufficient level of that solar energy that's constantly raining down on the earth is one of the main technological challenges of our future.
But it's mostly just been inhibited. I mean, it's mostly about
Right.
the special interests of petroleum death capital that has been sitting on the fucking hose of innovation.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
implementation. It's not even at this point about innovation anymore. It's about implementation.
No, and technologies for harnessing solar power, for harnessing energy from the sun, have been around for a long time. And again, the story is just about capital getting
We saw
in the
that
way.
parallel world, right? Because Jimmy Carter had solar panels on the White House in the 1970s. And what ends up happening is not only symbolic, but also a symbol of the foreshadowing of the Reagan administration is the tearing down of solar panel from the White House and the further deepening entrenchment of the petrol state.
Yep. Okay, so how might a world of free shelter for all affect the planet, biosphere, and ecosystems when we think of restoration and repair? In the context of restoration and
It's hard to imagine because with the way we think about housing is always like massively ecologically devastating, right? It disrupts ecologies and plants and those sort of things. But restoration and repair can be enacted the way that they're designed and their density. So we can imagine when we talk about medium density and the removal of the suburbs as a concept, no longer prioritizing and privileging suburban sprawl, we can imagine where we can actually build housing that has a lighter footprint, both in its production and also in its location.
We mentioned before, but part of meeting this requirement and part of aiding towards restoration and repair of the biosphere would be things like net positive structures, net positive buildings. So buildings that not only generate enough of their own energy to meet their needs, but then generate more than they need. So they
We
give
see all
back.
those utopian images of skyscrapers that have trees on them, or they're maybe biologically constructed. So we kind of like living structures.
But we also think about not just in terms of net positive energy, but part of that net positive equation being through carbon sequestration for systems on and within buildings to sequester carbon from the air. We can think about more widely adopted systems for material reclamation, reuse, and recycling of all the building materials, concrete, glass, steel, wood, and so forth. Also of repairing sprawl. I think sprawl repair, desuburbanization is a big part of this, how our focus on providing shelter and part of how we provide shelter for everyone is going to necessarily be providing, as you said, medium density, providing more of that missing middle housing and desuburbanizing. So in mixed schemes, it depends on specific suburbs, exurbs, and so forth, and specific ecologies and environments, whether or not those things need to be wholly removed and rewilded entirely or partially or some combination therein, or in some cases maybe need to be infilled so that there's greater density.
Yep, absolutely.
So it really depends. I mean, I think
there's not a consistent vision of what this is going to look like. It's going to depend on the region, the area, the inputs and outputs.
Yes.
And really thinking about how could we maximize what we do? Because we need to put people into homes. We need to protect them from massive devastation, whether it's earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods. We have to create better, richer, deeper housing, but at the same time, do harm reversal, not just harm reduction.
One exercise that we mentioned previously, but I like to remind myself of is walking through the city, traveling through the city, and seeing all the parked cars everywhere, just envisioning each one of those parked automobiles being replaced with a tree.
Yes.
So replace every car with a tree. And as part of moving towards a reality of the city and of cities becoming forests, especially where they once were forests, becoming forests again. But even in places that weren't necessarily forest-like, that as you mentioned, trees on buildings is one of the things that happens.
We get excited by it. I mean, when we typically think of utopia, we don't think of desert ecologies, which is a whole other thing. It's where we can't tell the garden from the building.
Yes. Yeah, well, we shouldn't be able to tell the city from the forest if we have the right balance of trees and green in our urban areas.
And that's what happens when housing moves from private plunder to communal belonging.
Yeah, yeah. Part of that could absolutely be the other side of desuburbanization. And it's not just about taking all of the area of, say, Los Angeles that's zoned for single family houses and whatever 70% plus of that is zoned for single family housing and making that all medium density. We don't need to just grow like that. We need to take some big chunks of that and
rewild it. Yeah.
Rewild it, make it forest.
Rewild it. So drain the hyper density of the city.
Yes.
So the suburbs turn into medium density.
Yes.
And the cities become basically wilded.
Yeah.
That's what ends up happening is we end up wilding the city.
Wild city. Okay.
Ooh.
Healthcare. So how might free healthcare for everyone on the planet affect the planet, the biosphere, and its ecosystems when we consider climate change?
Well, we have to think most immediately about pandemics and the nature of pandemics. Many of the pandemics that have happened are connected to inflammations, which is a book we could talk about and deal with later called Inflamed. And also that the encroachment and destruction of nature is coming back to bite us. It's basically boomerang karma, where we're getting karmic retribution for our destruction of nature. And so when we think about climate change and healthcare, our healthcare is being imperiled. The cost of healthcare is being imperiled by the ecological devastation we're involved with.
You mentioned already the changing climate and all of the poisoning of the air, the water, and the soil is having harmful health effects on humans, but ultimately is pointing at the potential mass death, potential extinction of human beings.
We talk about that 30,
in terms of healthcare,
scientists talking about that 35 degrees Celsius. Well, 35 degrees Celsius, forget about pandemics, where the heat waves could be so immense, there's a power outage, and you just have an entire city just die because the heats are so intense.
You're talking about the wet bulb 35.
Wet bulb 35.
Which is when the humidity and the heat are so much to get combination.
Yeah, that's a very scary thing. In Japan is going to have real concerns with humidity and heat, where it's almost intolerable and you can't even survive. And where air conditioning is a life or death thing, right? Heating is a life or death thing. There were children that died in Dallas during the cold snap where the jet stream collapsed, and they didn't have the infrastructure to deal with the tremendous cold that Texas is not designed for.
All of which point to how we're seeing right now. We are seeing right now it play out how not having healthcare for all is part of our experience of the collapsing climate. It's part of how it's making that experience even worse. It's compounding tragedies. Also, I think about how the end of capitalism will likely mean the end of the modern mental health epidemic. That so much of what is our modern global mental health epidemic over the last 50 plus years is a result of living in the system of capitalism.
And Mark Fisher was one of the key figures in thinking about how the externalization of capitalism affects the internalization of our mind, our psychosis, our mental health. And, David Graeber had said in a piece that 10% of the U.S. economy is based on work exhaustion and mental stress and mental disorder from the atomization of ourselves through capitalism and overwork. And as we think about the mental health aspects of that, that's another way of approaching this.
It reminds me that meme that we made a few months back with the race car, with capitalism.
Capitalism is the car.
Capitalism is this machine producing systems of hierarchy, but it's a machine in which we're racing towards oblivion. And we're killing ourselves in that race, but ultimately that race is just to kill ourselves off once and for all.
And we seem to want to watch that NASCAR race to watch the crash, right? Everybody's waiting around for the crash. You can repair the tires as much as you want, but a crash seems to be inevitable.
Terminal dystopia syndrome.
TDS.
We all see the reality that we are on this race car towards oblivion that is burning up carbon, heating up the atmosphere, changing the climate of the planet. It's killing us off, that we're all doomed. And we just want to see it play out. We want to run the rest of the race.
This moment of COVID, and the left always needs a catastrophe to organize, unfortunately. We never work from median changes or transitional harm reductions. Usually a catastrophe where the left can organize is COVID gives us the opportunity to reroute ourselves because we were headed on a train. The train was completely going off the tracks. And COVID is a way to slow down, put us in our houses, and think. It's a timeout. I mean, I almost want to feel like aliens had created COVID just to get us to slow down. And I could imagine, aliens coming in and saying, hey, we can't violate the prime directive from Star Trek, so we'll just create microbes that can get you to fucking think things through. It's a timeout room. We're being put in a timeout room. And part of that is through COVID, we can actually reimagine society because COVID is a smaller version of climate collapse.
Part of the climate collapse. And you're kind of segueing us to the next part, which is to consider the context of restoration and repair. So how does healthcare for all affect the planet, biosphere, and ecosystems in terms of restoration and repair? And it makes me think of that moment at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, just following its designation as a global pandemic, in which much of North America and Europe and elsewhere went into lockdown mode. And we were all marveled at how empty cities were and how reports of...
It was like Vanilla Sky. It was like the movie Vanilla Sky with Tom Cruise, where Times Square was empty.
Reports of wildlife returning to areas and stuff like that.
And everybody's celebrating like, oh, we can hear sonar waves and algae, the bioluminescence in the ocean and stuff.
I haven't seen it, but I did see that there's a documentary, a David Attenborough documentary about that week or however long it was, about
nature returning as we hid in our houses.
As we hid away. But that was only a very limited, that was like, a week or something that lasted? And then the state gave up and said, go back to work, everybody back to your business as usual.
And remember, this is how terrifying it is. We need a 50% reduction in carbon in 10 years, right? That's what should happen. We all were in our house, many people that could afford to live in a house or have a house, and people just weren't working. And it was only a 17% reduction in carbon.
We've got to do a lot more than that.
Exactly.
Yep. We've got to do a lot more than that. Another part of this, too, that the COVID pandemic highlights is that habitat restoration is going to be key to preventing future pandemics.
Oh, absolutely.
Future zoonotic diseases becoming pandemics because...
biodiversity creates buffers. It creates buffers from ecological havoc. When you line up 5 maple trees or 25 maple trees down a street, you're actually really hurting the ecology. And so biodiversity for ourselves and nature. I think one of the things that's illustrative, and it's not a coincidence, that the death empire of the U.S. military and the United States is the only country without health care. That this carceral permanent death camp that is the United States, it's not coincidental that we don't have universal health care. We don't have guaranteed rights to health care. Because if we actually did have that system, it would change our perspective on nature and to ourselves and the broader global community. That the death drive is so pronounced that the only way we can imagine unity is through constant war, not through care. And that would be a great transformation. If we have Medicare for all, it would ecologically harmonize us with the rest of the planet.
Oh, yeah. That helps to illustrate how all of these are interconnected. And much of what this long conversation has done is, again, keep retracing certain things, but we can't do one without the other.
Yeah, there's a positive loop. There's a positive loop in how each one of these inform themselves, especially when we talk about repair.
Yeah. And we need repair and rewilding so we can scrub the carbon from the atmosphere in part. We need to reintroduce more pollinators, more biodiversity, and in doing so, listen to long-held indigenous wisdom and start to listen again to the wisdom of the trees because we have the potential to not just decrease our collective so-called impact on nature, but we are part of nature and we can actually collectively have a positive impact on the biosphere. We can actually help make the planet healthier. It's kind of one of the more depressing parts of this set of considerations to ruminate on because our potential is such, technologically and otherwise, that we could actually make the planet more biologically and ecologically diverse and bountiful than it is on its own.
Yes. You actually could have hyperdiversity, we can imagine. So diversities we haven't seen or felt. And this is astrophysicists talk about when they go planet hunting, but there's other potential super Earths, which are even potentially more diverse, biologically diverse than our own planet. We assume it's the most diverse in the galaxy or the universe, but we could take that kind of imagineering and think about how could we create new diversities that don't even exist.
It's not just that we need to try to prevent runaway climate catastrophe. We have the scientific, technological, material potential to live on Earth in a manner that optimizes conditions for the flourishing of all life on Earth.
It's a design democracy problem, right? It's really a design democracy problem.
Which connects back to what we were saying earlier about the fantasies of terraforming Mars. It's
the projections of what you want to do here.
Right. Those seem wildly ironic when we're in the midst of this climate collapse, because we could otherwise direct those to...
Well, we need to terraform this planet for biodiversity. So we need to do terraforming to return it to what it used to be, its former glory.
Yes. So moving on to our final one.
Our final node and the final category, ecologies and education.
Yes. So how might a world of free education for all affect the planet, the biosphere, and ecosystems in terms of climate change?
Well, it moves away from consumption of material goods to the foresting of our brains. Right now, what we do with our body and our time is consume, especially in the first world, in the global north, we would consume massive amounts of resources. That experiences and growth is happening inside the universe of our souls, in our spirits and our minds. And so by moving towards education, cradle to grave, we move away from consumption to internal growth. And that's a huge reformation. So while we move to carbon enhancement of the earth, we're also growing ourselves within ourselves through intellectual inquiry and discovery. And education, of course, can be part of the solution. Using the universities and the educational institutions to actually innovate for ecology.
I think that the reality is that whether we do so on the road to building a world of the golden square or not, major investments in education, major focus on education is going to be needed, is going to be necessary to adapt to living on Earth with a different climate. And it's just going to be a matter of whether or not we handle these circumstances in a Cold War fashion, which is what the state and the imperial core and state capitalism and global capitalism seem set to do, with the nations of the imperial core preparing themselves to rule over the world in an era of eco-apartheid and mass extinction. Or we can do so in a way that would avoid all of that death and destruction by embracing a new common sense that recognizes free education for all as the bare minimum of a decent world. We do it according to the golden square, or we do it according to competition.
It's the most low carbon of all of the nodes. Has the most low carbon potential. So post-scarcity education is a term I like to use because we often hear from educators the phrase never enough. There's never enough money or resources or spaces for classrooms. Classes are too large. There's not enough time for mentorship. And if we move to a system, we imagine an entire planet where every teacher has 15 students. Think of all the hiring and jobs you could create from that. And it's a way of moving from manufacturing, not just consumption, but the jobs that are created from manufacturing become, it's no longer a factory of production. It's a factory of thinkers. And curiosity, inquisitiveness, creativity, and the ever-flowing growth of human potential by creating a whole new hegemony of jobs based on education.
Well, we have real-world problems to solve, major real-world problems to solve, beyond just the idiotic things that are in the way. By major problems, we're talking about climate change. We're talking about coming climate collapse. There are all kinds of problems that are major problems that are just dumb, that are just fucking stupid, like homelessness. Just give everybody a house, right? There are all kinds of things that are just the insistence of systems of domination and hierarchy on maintaining and furthering systems of power, on keeping their own power. And those are just dumb problems, but they're real problems about how do we address the dynamics of a changing climate on this planet that we need to learn. We need to educate ourselves. We have new things to do. We have new jobs to learn how to do. We have different technologies to implement and to install and to use. So that's why we need a Green New Deal for education. If we need a Green New Deal, we need a Green New Deal.
That's the only way we're going to create post-scarcity education. Because the emergency of the climate crisis allows us to think about a post-scarcity horizon for education. It's the only way through.
Indeed. So how about in terms of restoration and repair? What does a world of free education for all mean for our planet in terms of restoration and repair work that needs to be done?
It's a recreation of new social relations. We have the ecology of our minds, right, and the ecology of nature, and we have attachment issues. We're very detached. And so restoration and repair, we have to create the educational arrangements and awareness, the consciousness raising to actually talk about reparations, both indigenous and ecological. We have to have a kind of Marshall Plan for the biosphere when it comes to the global south. How are we going to get people to agree to that without an education project? It's like Murray Bookchin said, every educational project is a revolutionary project.
Yep.
And if we're going to create a horizon for reparations, ecological and indigenous as well as racial reparations, we're going to have an educational project. And yes, we're going to have critical race theory.
Yes.
But we're going to also have critical capitalist theory about the harms of capitalism and a real account of these harms.
Yeah, if we're going to become Earthseed, we need to learn how to actually engage in decolonial practice. We need to, how to engage in decolonial thinking, how to decolonize our minds and our world. If we're going to ever live in right relationship with the biosphere, then free education for all is going to be essential. And it's going to be essential to the generations-long project ahead of us to nourish the development of an ecological society. Okay, what else? Final thoughts.
Wow, thank you for joining us on this journey.
Well, I think what I'd maybe like to wrap up with is just returning to the notion of the golden square as the bare minimum for a decent society, for a dignified world, as the new social contract that if we can build our world, reshape our world based on this social contract of providing as non-negotiable human rights to every person on the planet, free food, shelter, healthcare, and education from cradle to grave, then we are talking about creating the conditions from which we can then start to imagine, then start to build, start to experience a utopian world.
The utopian sphere, the social singularity. I mean, this is the calling of our lives. The generations we have right now, the edging and horizon of the twilight years for boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, this is a calling that's intergenerational in the here and now, that this is not only the social contract, this is the organizing principle of our lives in this 10-year window that we have with climate change. And maybe we always needed this crisis of climate change to actually get the golden square. For centuries, we've never had it. And we've had an inequality of unequals. We've had the scarcity of resources. Now we have the scarcity of ideas. And we need to create post-scarcity of resources and post-scarcity of ideas. And the golden square is the basis for this.
Yes. Yeah, and as much as this incomplete imagining of the world of the Golden Square in this marathon conversation that we've just had about it is just a glimpse of what that would be, the world of the Golden Square that we're attempting to describe would really be just the beginning. So yes, indeed, we are utopian, but this vision, this insistence, this demand is just the transitional demand. And still, this transitional demand of the basis for dignity, the basis for material conditions of freedom is just the beginning of what is possible.
Indescribable potentials.
So much more potential in our future that we could already be in if it weren't for this rule of capital over our world. If it weren't for these systems of domination and hierarchy that are just blocking us from our potential.
And the poison pyramid.
If it wasn't for this poison pyramid, we could already be living in a world of the Golden Square because it is not a matter of practical limitations. We have everything that we need to do it. All right. Here we are, the final wrap up to this 3-part conversation. What do you think looking back on this whole conversation, Matt?
Thinking of the Beatles' Long and Winding Road, that line.
And just as was hinted at in our conversation about housing, so we had one conversation where we talked about free housing. It should be right. Housing should be free. That should be a bare minimum expectation. But we're so far from there. So we did a discussion on, well, how do we get from here to there? That difficult part about not just imagining the end of capitalism, but what the road through to the end of capitalism looks like, what the transition to the end of capitalism looks like. And so we called that episode The Long Winding Road to Decommodification because it is a long, winding, treacherous road. And that's only one small component of this overall conception of the Golden Square. So all of this, it's a lot of work in front of us.
Healthcare and education and food. That's the other parts of the node.
Everything must change. And if we start with this as the organizing principle for society, everything will change. I'm ready.
I'm ready.
Are you?
Yeah, let's go.
Let's do the work. Thanks for another conversation and more soon in the next one. See you then.
Cheers.
Cheers.